I used to give a lecture that my students would challenge me on. I would say the following. Some people voted for Adolf Hitler because he was an anti-Semite. Others voted for him despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, feeling three things. Number one, that the majesty of office would force him to the center, that the guardrails of the democratic government would not allow him to carry out the most radical parts of his agenda, and conservatives felt that they could achieve their agenda with him. And as men, and I'm being gender specific because the leadership was then all male, as men of experience, they could control him instead of he controlling them. When I gave that lecture 15 years ago or 10 years ago, my students would challenge every one of those statements and would force me to document it, and I can document it with empirical evidence. My students today will say, what else is new?
Thank you for being with us, Michael. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
How can we know anything about the Holocaust now? You know, because I didn't experience it. Priscilla didn't experience it. Our families, I lost family members there, but I don't really know. Like, how do we know anything about the Holocaust?
Well, the answer to that is simply that the Germans kept meticulous records, the Jews kept meticulous records. And therefore, what you have the intersection of the perpetrator records and the victim records. We also have in the aftermath, there is the physical remains, meaning, I've done a project with Auschwitz in which we bring some of the material remains from Auschwitz. I've seen what Auschwitz has evolved. I developed the museum and the memorial at Belzhitz. You have physical remains. You also have a new field which has just developed, which is another way of figuring it out, which is the archaeology of genocide. But the archaeology of genocide is something very different right now because of the ground penetrating radar.
Mm-hmm.
Know what we are going to find before we dig.
Right.
Consequently, we don't have to dig the entire area up, and we know specifically. So, for example, they've just dug up Sobibor, which was one of the death camps, and you can see the physical remains of the gas chambers, the physical remains of what was there. You can see where the mass burial fields are, and all of that. We also have an incredible amount of survivor testimony. I mean, when I was with the Shoah Foundation, we recorded 52,000 testimonies, 32 languages, 57 countries. By now, you would have 80,000 video testimonies of the Holocaust. Now, to contrast that, the Smithsonian has 36 oral histories of people who were slaves.
Right.
And we have 80,000 testimonies of people who went through this, including liberators, including bystanders. And now there's a man, a Father Patrick Dubois, who's been interviewing 90-year-old people and asking them where the mass killings fields are in the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And they were eyewitnesses to this. Photographs exist, historical documents exist, diaries exist, massive amount of material. And frankly, the problem for any scholar, including a hardworking workaholic like me, is how the hell do you keep up with your field?
What significance does Anna Stern's story have for understanding the Holocaust?
Well, tell me the story for a moment.
Anna Stern was in the camps. She was passing away. and she gave a book to a friend who went to Israel, couldn't find that friend.
Yes, you're talking. Oh, that's I was deeply involved in that. I wrote the forward.
Yeah, you were.
I wrote the forward. I wrote the forward to that. Let me tell you what's involved in that. It's a fabulous story. Yom Kippur, 1944, the Day of Atonement, 1944. She's dying. She says, "Do me a favor. I'm not going to survive. If you see my daughter Anna Stern in Palestine, which was the name of pre-state Israel, give her this material." The woman survives. She comes to Palestine. She doesn't find an Anna Stern. She's at a party in 1967, and she meets an Anna Stern who was from Prague via Palestine. And she says to her, "I have a present for you from your mother." Now you have to imagine what it's like to receive a present from your mother 23 years after her death. What is the present? The present is a series of recipes that were gathered, which are the material remains of Jewish family life from Central Europe. What are the physical remains of Jewish family life when you no longer have a family? They're pictures. There are a couple of artifacts that you may have if you had, your father's wine goblet, your father's Kiddush cup, your mother's candlesticks, but most people couldn't preserve that. So what did she have? She asked the women, her mother asked the women, "We're coming on Passover. Priscilla, what would you make for Passover in your home?" Write the recipe.
Are you asking me?
What's your favorite recipe?
Mine? Are you actually asking?
No, I'm just saying she would ask, assuming you were, God forbid, a prisoner, she'd ask you, what was your favorite recipe? And what are the ingredients and how do you do it? Well, P.S., they compiled this, and it is the remnants of what was served on a table when these women had families and these women had homes and the like. We published it. And then actually they brought it to me. I was at the Holocaust Museum in those days. They brought it in and they said, "Here's a Holocaust cookbook." And I said, "What do you mean a Holocaust cookbook?" I opened the document and I said, all of these recipes, they are what gave these women family life, what is the remnant of their family life. It's like the children's drawings. It's like the poems, it's like the diaries, it's all of this. We published the cookbook. We found two things that were very interesting. Number one is no recipe was perfect.
Right.
You really need a kitchen to write a recipe. And you need to be able, my mother used to say, you got to taste it.
Right.
Seasoned to taste. What do you mean seasoned to taste? You need, cooking is a physical gesture.
Yeah.
So we publish it, and then I come up accidentally with a great line, and it sells like hotcakes. I tell the people who are buying the cookbook, we won't sell you the cookbook unless you make two promises. Promise number one is you will tell these women's stories.
Right.
Because every recipe comes with a story. And the second thing is that you will only cook from it for a joyous occasion.
Right.
They suffered enough.
Yeah.
So right after that, my daughter was getting married, and we cooked the dessert from this, and we said, you are tasting the recipe of so-and-so who was from there, but we're not talking about death, we're talking about celebration.
Yeah.
Invite her into this joyous occasion, and the place went raucous.
Right.
Amazing.
We
Yeah.
publish it, and then something else happens, which is all of a sudden, 8 or 9 other cookbooks materialize of women who were doing this in other camps.
Yeah.
And I say women because I'm gender specific at this moment. There could have been men who did this. We didn't discover this among men. We did discover it among women. 10 years go by, and a French filmmaker comes to me and wants to interview me on this. And she has done a film now on cookbooks that are created in gulags by starving people internationally. Soviet prisons, Cuban prisons, Chinese prisons, Cambodian prisons, all of them as a way of self-preservation, spiritual resistance, dignity.
Yeah.
So this story of the Holocaust gives us a remnant of Central European life. It also gives us, when you discover it, it gives us the idea of how do women preserve their dignity amidst starvation when you're always talking of food. So if you can't eat, if Jews who go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, half the discussion is about food because we're fasting. The rest of the day, the rest of the occasions, you may not talk about food at all, but you're fasting, all of a sudden you're deprived of food. Put men or women in an institution in which they are separated from by gender and they're not gay, and they will talk about sexual relations. But one of the ways in which these women dealt with starvation was to recreate what they had lost. Tells us, to my mind, a beautiful thing about the victims.
What does it do to a person to eat matzah out of a crematoria on Passover?
A great question. And I'll tell you the answer to that in a very interesting way. If you're a traditional Jew, there's the Haggadah, the Passover service. And one of the questions asked in the Haggadah is, where do we learn that you tell the story of Passover all the days of your life? They come up with a proof text. It says, to tell the story of your exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. The days of your life means during daytime. All the days of your life meaning at night. Now, if you take that not as a physical description of light and darkness, but as a description of your spiritual state, it's easy to talk about redemption when you are redeemed. It's easy to talk about redemption when you're free. Let's presume for a moment that the Sonderkommando working in the vicinity of Auschwitz were in the deepest form of exile ever known to humanity. If not the deepest form of exile ever known to humanity, one of the deepest forms of exile. What is the meaning of exile, of Egypt, of slavery, of servitude, if not that? The idea that they could then dare to dream and could use an instrument of death as an instrumentality of hope is a sign of the capacity of human beings to endure in virtually any circumstances. So if you interpret it that way, on one level it's grotesque, on the other level it's noble. But we should tell the story of liberation all the days of our life, including those awful days when we can't feel it and can't sense it.
For them, an easier choice could have been to commit suicide. And so Sonderkommando witnessing as a witness and then being able to record that afterwards plays an important role in us having any understanding of what actually happened there. Yeah.
Well, Jesse, you've said something very important. At Birkenau, and I've been to Birkenau many times, I've worked through the camp almost inch by inch. At Birkenau, you were no more than 100 feet away from electrified wires, 1,000 times a day. So every day you had to make a decision not to go to the wires. And many people did go to the wires, they just couldn't take it anymore. But for some, the urge to live is so overwhelming, so powerful, or their defiance of death is so great that they didn't go to the wire. But I was amazed when I first visited the camps that death not only surrounded you, but was an immediately available option by moving 100 feet, 100 yards, no more than that. Because the camps were divided into the segments of Birkenau were divided into electrified barbed wire surrounding every element. And the idea was, they had a term for it, go to the fence, go to the wires.
You know, this thing of death being everywhere, and the Germans using the word medical, you know, as if medical justified what would happen. They would never say death. And I mean, what do you make of that? You know, is that the doubling effect? Is that, you know, what is that?
We sometimes use language to deceive the other, to deceive ourselves. Everybody does that. Let me give us one of the clearest examples in the use in America by the media. We say so-and-so died from friendly fire. I don't know if it were my kid or me, my daughter, my son. The idea that they died not from enemy fire, but from quotation marks, there's nothing friendly about the fire. It's incompetence, it's stupidity, it's you know, laziness, it's carelessness. We call it friendly fire. They used words. Deportation became resettlement to the east. The systematic murder of Jews became the final solution to the Jewish problem. Now, the words are elegant. If you call the Jews a problem, what do you want to do with a problem? You want to solve a problem. And the final solution, which is murder of men, women, and children, means there are no Jews left. The problem is solved once and for all. The way in which they did it, we took executive action, they would write. Executive action were executions. So you in part deceive yourself and you deceive others, and that enables you to do a whole range of things that you don't want to face up to actually doing, presuming that you still have a remnant of conscience.
Can I ask a question, Michael? Before you get to that point, what else is the narrative that gets put out such that makes an environment like this possible, right? You have to be telling a story. And what was from your perspective as an historian and a scholar?
Let's look at the use of language. The Jews were regarded as cancer. Now, that gave the medical justification. Let me be graphic, but not too graphic, hopefully, and you'll censor it if you want to. You'll tone it down. If I am a physician and I walk around with a white coat, and I look at your x-rays, and God forbid I see that you have cancer in your breast, I say, I'm sorry, you need a mastectomy. And I'm a healer. If I walk in and I cut off, God forbid, a woman's left breast, I'm what? I'm a violator, I'm a destroyer, I'm an abuser, etc., etc. The difference between the two is the diagnosis of cancer. The terminology, and we use this in medical schools even, is that they used healing by killing, which is the title of a film. And that is, and they regard it as a medical action. In fact, the gas vans arrived at Birkenau, at the gas chambers at the crematoria, in Red Cross trucks. God forbid your audience should think that it was actually the Red Cross. But Nazis painted their trucks with a red cross to give it the sense that it was a medical action. The gas was dropped down the vents of the crematoria, and then a doctor would have to pronounce the dead dead.
But
So
they didn't
used the doctors as a means of medicalizing the process and therefore legitimating it, because doctors always deal with quotation marks life and death.
But now,
Here they were handling a cancer.
but they would say everything is done, not they're all dead.
That's right. Language was very, very important, and they used it oftentimes with precision. By the way, they would break from it because, on the other hand, they would want to brag about what they did.
Right.
The best example of that is there was a speech given October 4th, 1943 by Heinrich Himmler, who spoke to about 500 SS officers and who said to do what we have done, and aside from a few cases of greed and the like, to have accomplished it in such a humane way. This is a chapter of German history never to be written, never to be told. Now, if you take that seriously, you have to ask yourself the question, how the hell do I know about it 77 years after the event, if it's never to be written, never to be told? Well, in the back of the auditorium, he had an old-fashioned tape recorder, which in those days was big. It's not like this. It was a big machine. Why? Because he was uttering words that he wanted recorded for history, even though it was never to be written, never to be told.
Yeah.
And we have a recording in the National Archives of Himmler's speech. We have his original notes because he was proud of it.
You know, Michael, what were the trips, between hope and despair of the train ride to get to one of the camps?
Let's begin a little bit backwards. What did the trains represent? The trains represented a transition in the mode of killing. The first stage of killing Jews in particular was to send mobile killers to stationary victims, to shoot them person by person, bullet by bullet, men, women, and children, town by town, village by village, hamlet by hamlet, city by city, one by one. That became problematic for the killers. Too public, psychologically difficult. They needed alcohol afterwards, then they needed alcohol before, and they needed alcohol sometimes during. It also became a little bit messy because adjacent to many of these towns, you have massive killing fields. And it also turned the local populace not so much against the Germans, but so much that they understood that they were real killers and anything could happen. It didn't build up calmness and goodwill within the occupied territories. They then reversed the process, which is they made the victims mobile. They sent them to stationary killing centers. Stationary killing centers were conducted on the principle of Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, and the principle of Henry Ford, an assembly line. In certain places, there was no selection. Everybody was sent to death. Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, Hamla. Auschwitz, there was selection because they preserved certain segments for labor. But deportation became the transitional, and all of the major death camps were located on rail lines, which allowed for easy transport. The best example is Auschwitz. Auschwitz had 44 parallel railroad tracks. And that meant that the town, which had been a cross-section years ago between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German state, became a center that could absorb people from throughout Europe. All railroad tracks could merge with 44 parallel tracks. You were put on the train, you were told you're going to resettle in the East. It was the last moment that you were together with your mother and father, and if you're a parent, with your children, maybe even with your grandparents. It's the last moment you're a family. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what's going to happen to you. Your total possessions consist of 20 kilo, about 44 pounds that you've taken with you. And you're on a train. If you're coming, for example, from Hungary, with 437,402 Jews were shipped on trains from Hungary, you're several days, 4, 5, 6 days. You don't have a place to take care of your biological needs. You occasionally get water in a bucket. You have very little food, if any, and you're going to the unknown. Imagine what the conversations are in such a place. You're sitting in your own feces because they're in a cattle car. But imagine what the conversations are. Imagine what the anxiety is. Imagine a young mother whose breasts are running dry of milk and can't feed her child. Imagine how you console a son or a daughter. And that's what the train was like. So when they opened the doors, you thought you had survived the worst. And then you were brought into a new world in which the unimaginable was happening all around you. You then, at Auschwitz, for example, men were put to one side, women to another, women and children to another. You had separation. Then you had selection. One group went to the gas chamber. The other group went to what is called the sauna, but don't think of it as a sauna, where in Texas terms, they were branded and sheared. They got numbers on their arm. They lost all their hair from every part of their body. And then they were put into work. They were given uniforms, which consisted of some woolen pajamas and wooden clogs, and they were sent to work. And they didn't know what happened to the other people. And many survivors said, I asked, where's my wife? Where's my child? And then occasionally somebody pointed to the sky and to the chimney, which were bellowing black smoke, and said, there they are. So what does the train represent? It's the last moment of family. It's the transition. It's a horrific experience in and of itself. And after that, it only gets worse.
You know, you hear the term robots or automated. You know, you hear that over and over again in the when people talk about the Holocaust. What did that mean? You know, what does that mean when they start to see themselves that way?
You hear that most often in something called the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando were the people who worked in the vicinity of the death camps who were intimate with the act of death. I've been teaching a course on Holocaust film, and I just showed a film called Son of Saul, which was the Hungarian Academy Award winner a couple of years ago, which described the life of the Sonderkommando. The only way you could work in the vicinity of death like that is to become numb and to shut down. And consequently, the language that is used, it's a language that's found throughout the testimonies. We became automatons, we became robots. Why? Because you couldn't have a wide humanity. I contrasted it ironically. And what gave Son of Saul a human feature to it is essentially that the Sonderkommando, this was around October 7th, 1944. The film is depicting a moment in the life of Auschwitz, Birkenau really, which is Auschwitz too. And what it was one group was preparing for an uprising. See, the last of the great Jewish communities, the Jewish community of Hungary, was transported to Auschwitz. The trains were not coming in. Sonderkommando understood that they would be killed very shortly because they are the most dangerous witnesses. They have seen it all. So they prepared for an uprising. Women smuggled in some dynamite and gunpowder so they could set the place aflame. And Saul in the film, ironically, is trying to bury one child. And he says is his son, but it's probably symbolically his son. He's looking for a rabbi who can say the memorial prayer, the Kaddish, and bury the child with a certain sense of dignity. So everybody's, the two groups are achieving a certain measure of humanity, one by standing up for themselves, and the other by insisting that at least one child, instead of being burned, is buried in a traditional rite with a certain measure of dignity. Both fail, but for a moment, their loss of any range of human emotion is closed down. Now, there's another film, which is probably the most historically true film made about the Holocaust, but is ironically not a great film because it stays true to the idea that the Sonderkommando had limited range of human emotions. And you know what makes films great sometimes is the depth of human emotion. And that's The Gray Zone, which deals with these men who were condemned to be intimate with death, never killing. The killing was always done by the SS, but being with the victims as they hung up their clothes, dragging the bodies out of the gas chamber, putting them into the crematoria, even dissecting some of them who died seemingly or who were killed seemingly with perhaps some valuables inside themselves. So all of this was, it became very difficult to have a range of human emotion. Now, people did have human emotion in the camps. Women speak of camp sisters. People speak of there were moments in which prayer was recited. You asked at the very beginning a very interesting question, which is, how do we know? I continue to learn, which is one of the reasons that makes the field interesting. We did this exhibition on Auschwitz, and last year we got an artifact, which again, like the Passover story of baking matzah, the artifact was the shofar, a shofar that was blown in Auschwitz. And when you hold that, you realize that the circumstances were, it was taken from a place called Canada where they gathered all the valuables, not Canada the country, but Canada a series of barracks. And somebody had put in their luggage a shofar, maybe somebody who had come in around the High Holy Days. And somebody stole it out of there. In camps, you never say you never stole, you organized it out of there. gave it to a work group that was working in the field so that they could blow it where nobody could hear. Now, the shofar is blown on the High Holy Days, on Rosh Hashanah, and there are three types of note. One is a full note, the other is a 3-note, and the other is a 9-note. Whole, fragmented, broken. And then at the end, you're supposed to blow one long blast, which makes it whole again, called Tekiah Gdola. And you got to imagine again, here's another example of where they had very limited range of human options, but they could, at one moment on the High Holy Days, imagine that they could come back from brokenness to wholeness. But remember, even if you come back from brokenness to wholeness, you once were broken. So there are scabs that remain.
You know, Michael, what is the preferred narrative allude to?
Different groups have preferred narratives. So the Israelis, for example, especially in the first years after the establishment of Israel, had a preferred narrative of resistance. They wanted to draw from the ashes something of what we call a usable history. And for them, that was the time in which human beings, out of the depth of despair, fought and at least defended honor and took some Germans with them, some Nazis with them. Other countries, East Germany, Austria had a preferred narrative, which was we were the first of the Nazi victims. Nazi Germany entered Austria in March of 1938. I took a course in Austrian history, and I left the course at a very particular moment. It was in Austria. Teacher said Austria was invaded in March 1938, and Austrian history resumes in 1945.
Right.
That was their preferred narrative. In East Germany, the preferred narrative was that the communists were victims of Nazism. We are the heirs of communism, of the communists. Therefore, we are not responsible for the Holocaust. It's you bastard capitalists in the West. Different countries, France used to have a preferred narrative, which dealt with resistance. Everybody was in resistance, and only in the 1990s did that become shattered with the Klaus Barbie trial and the like, when it became, instead of resistance, it became collaboration. And Francois Mitterrand became, instead of an anti-Nazi resistance figure, became somebody, we had discovered the story that he had been in reality a collaborator. Everybody had an invented history.
You know, the people who came out.
One more sentence.
Okay.
History is very often not only a recounting of the past, but it's a present dialogue with the past to shape the future that you want to shape, which is why you have a narrative.
Now, the people who came out early, before they had told the story many times, what's the importance of getting their thoughts right when they came out in the original languages, you know, to understand the experience for what we look at when we look back now?
Part of the great importance is they had no narrative in which to put it into. And when I mean they had no narrative to put it into, it means they only had the sorting out of raw data. And when you hear survivors' testimony today, you hear several things that are sometimes incorrect. Doesn't mean the testimony is lying. It's incorrect because they add to it what they've learned subsequently that made sense of what they experienced.
Right.
In other words, you add one survivor told me, he said, Michael, you know more about Auschwitz than I do. But the one thing you do not know is what it was like to live in Barrack 26. Why do I know more than he did? I have access to what the commandant was doing. He had no access. I had access to what the West was doing. I had access to German policy. I had access to what was happening in Auschwitz I and Auschwitz III, what the corporate investment was that created the slave labor, what type of products were produced. He had none of that. He only knew what his life was like in Barrack 26, and also the rumors that were being circulated, half of them true, some of them untrue, some of them exaggerated, some of them inaccurate. So in one sense, the historian uses this as raw material to piece together a coherent narrative.
Now, is it hard for you, Michael? You've been a leader, an important leader in this space for a very long time, doing very important work. Is it hard for you, as we look back on these things, just even today, is it difficult to tell these stories that are so important to tell?
I had a capacity of what's called entombment. In other words, I could build a tomb around myself when I worked on this material. But the more I built a tomb around myself when I worked with this material, the worse I was at working with this material, because I didn't know how my dealing with the material would impact on the audience. And I also had to permit myself not to become an automaton, to feel. Now, when I first started working with this, I had very young children. And I would come home at night, and sometimes, much to the chagrin of my wife, who had just gotten the kids to sleep or whatever have you, would want to wake up the kids and play with them on the floor, because I had to touch life in all of its vitality. I'd been surrounded by death. And when I had my young kids, jumping all over me and the like, I reveled in that, because I was, engaged in touching the organic vitality of life. My family pays a price for this. My wife will sometimes say she's Holocausted out. My son likes Sarah Silverman because she makes fun of the Holocaust. And it's interesting because we did a film on Holocaust humor, and we learned something very interesting, which may be a generational interest. We asked Mel Brooks, God forbid, very big difference.
Yeah,
we asked Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks said, "I'm not going there. Nothing humorous about the Holocaust. Hitler, that's another matter. You want me to do a comedy routine on Hitler right now? Let's go."
But there was a lot of I mean, Jews always have humor. So, there was a lot of humor in the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, this is one of the ways that Jews do to cope with things.
That's I'm happy you asked that. I must have set you up subconsciously with that. About 40 years ago, I was reading a book and laughing like hell. And I wasn't laughing easily. I was laughing with, my entire body. I even remember I was on my couch in the living room. And my kids came down and they said, "Abba, what are you reading?" And I was embarrassed to tell them that I was reading a Holocaust book. I didn't want to teach young kids, you read a Holocaust book, you laugh. And then I said to myself, if I'm laughing, I'm not the worst person in the world, because I studied the worst person in the world. So why am I laughing? Because the writer is using humor as a way to get to his story. So I started collecting humorous anecdotes. And I still have a file folder that's about this big of different humorous anecdotes, and an Israeli scholar wrote a book called It Kept Us Alive, Humor in the Holocaust. And when I wrote a review of it, I said I read this book with anger and with envy, because I've been collecting this material for 40 years, and I was afraid to write it because everybody would say Michael Berenbaum wrote a Holocaust joke book. But this is a documentation. So let me tell you two jokes of Holocaust humor, one of which could be used today. Four men get together on a street corner. One says, oi. The other one says, oi, oi. The third one says, oi, oi, oi. The fourth one says, gentlemen, if we're going to talk about politics all day, I'm leaving. And that, sadly, you could picture that today.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
True.
Actually, Michael, I think we've just spent, I mean, I don't even know how to describe this experience talking with you, but I want to just ask a question. I know it's on my mind. It might be on some of our viewers and listeners' mind. You know, when we saw the events at the Capitol, and we see those T-shirts, you know, could have done more, could have killed more. I mean, how do you deal with the anti-Semitism, the hatred, the racism? We have crimes against the Asian community. We continue. This hatred does not stop. It does not stop against many groups of people. But what is that? How does that make you reflect on, you know, the importance of what you do and why we have to remember, why we.
Priscilla, you're asking a profound question. My dream, you know, Martin Luther King had a dream. I have a dream. Martin Luther King said that someday my son will be judged by the content of his character, not the color of his skin. My dream is someday I want to be irrelevant. Meaning that the best ending I could have conceived of for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum would be to, when we were creating that, would be to say, this is what mid-20th century humanity did one to another. We could never do that. I wish I lived in a world in which what I studied could be confined to ancient history or 20th century history. It can't. Right now, in my field, everybody's interested in the question of what happened between 1919 and 1933. How did a democratic society that was polarized and ineffectual, divided and incompetent, transform itself by democratic means into a totalitarian, authoritarian society? That's a question we are asking with much greater urgency than we ever asked it before. Look at my colleague Timothy Snyder of Yale, who wrote on tyranny. Let me give you another example which addresses your question. I used to give a lecture that my students would challenge me on. I would say the following. Some people voted for Adolf Hitler because he was an anti-Semite. Others voted for him despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, feeling three things. Number one, that the majesty of office would force him to the center, that the guardrails of the democratic government would not allow him to carry out the most radical parts of his agenda, and conservatives felt that they could achieve their agenda with him. And as men, and I'm being gender specific because the leadership was then all male, as men of experience, they could control him instead of he controlling them. When I gave that lecture 15 years ago or 10 years ago, my students would challenge every one of those statements and would force me to document it, and I can document it with empirical evidence. My students today will say, what else is new? And I wish I was irrelevant. I wish
Michael,
what I knew could not be applied. Sadly, that's not the world I live in, and it's not the world I'm bequeathing to my kids or my grandchildren.
Michael, after all this time spent in these, looking at these things, do you have anything you can tell us about hate, why people hate?
Some people hate out of anger, some out of envy. Let me give you a simple example. Adolf Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power 32 days apart. They came as heads of, and they died, by the way, they died 18 days apart. So one rule that Hitler ruled 50 days longer than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They both came as heads of governments that were facing 25% unemployment rates, 40% decrease in gross national products. One turned the people one toward another, one turned the people one against the other. The most incredible thing that I've been sensing in the way in which we have dealt with our crises, and we're living through 5 or 6 different crises. We have an economic crisis, a health crisis, a climate crisis, social justice crisis, a governmental crisis, I could go on, is that the only way we can get out of it is to turn toward one another. My health is dependent upon your discipline, and your health is dependent on mine. We were both dependent on the scientists. We're now dependent on the government to distribute the vaccine. And the reality is we're all in this together. And unless we have a certain sense of commonality, we'll pull each other apart. Now, the easiest thing is to other somebody else. The most basic teaching of my religion, of most religions, and that means we have to get rid of all those things in our own religious or ethical universe that others other people. The most basic thing is all human beings are created in the image of God. Therefore, they have a certain sanctity and a certain dignity. And though I think I'm absolutely right, if the universe I face is so multiple, so diverse, that must be the divine will. And therefore, I have to celebrate that diversity and respect the other in their otherness and understand what we share in common. I understand not only hatred, but I also understand what it takes to counteract hatred, which is to see the humanity in the other. French Huguenot village, Le Chambon. Pastors André Trumay, they ended up saving 5,000 Jewish youngsters. Remember, it's a Protestant village in Catholic France. What did he teach? He ended every sermon every week with the same phrase. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might, and go love thy neighbor as thyself. Go practice it. Those are simple values, basic values. The most important element for me, the very important element for me, is the notion, if we come, that all persons are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among them are life and liberty. I'll go a little bit less with pursuit of happiness, but life and liberty, which means we're all in this together. Even in our world today, my remaining healthy is dependent not only on America getting vaccines, but on people in the world getting vaccines. I travel for my profession. I'm due in next month in Serbia. I'm doing 2 months in Poland and 3 months in Israel. The only way I can do my work is if everybody else gets vaccinated, not only Americans. The only way my children can go back to school, or my grandchildren can go back to school and have kids in college and grandchildren in school, the only way is if everybody gets vaccinated and people remain safe, responsible. We're all in this together. So pulling apart, polarizing, othering in whatever way, othering because somebody's gay, othering because they're Asian American, othering because they're a different color, often othering because they're a different political party, a different religion. Let's emphasize what we share in common. Let's say everybody is entitled to basic humanity, to decency, to compassion, and let's celebrate differences and let's engage them. I learn. We're having Passover another week. I will have a Black pastor and a Roman Catholic priest at my table. Their experience of my Seder will enhance the experience for the religious Jews who are at the Seder at the same way. They will learn about me. I will learn about them. We'll both learn about the tradition. We have so much to learn from each other and to ways of being with each other, that the othering of this is a terribly dangerous thing. And our country right now is suffering from terrible polarization instead of where we share and what we share in common by coming together.
Michael, thank you so much. This has been an incredible time. I really appreciate you being here with us.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Stay safe, stay well.
You too. Thank you, Michael.